I am so joyed to just be with you today and, talk about Torah on such a day as this. Every day is a good day, actually, to talk about Torah. Torah is, I use that word intentionally. You may be wondering why I've been using this term Torah all along. And frankly, I'll tell you it's because I don't like the word law. I don't like the word law. So much of these books, these 5 books of the Pentateuch, we call them the law. And some of that just is the way things have happened with the Greek language, translating it as nomos and so forth. But here's the deal. Torah is God's instruction. Torah is God's revelation of himself. And I like to use the word Torah because it makes us think like, oh, what is that? What does that mean exactly? Because I think when we use the word law, it makes us think the wrong stuff, actually. I don't like the word law. I think law is a negative word. We kind of bristle when we say the word law, when we think about law. Law is a rule to keep, right? And I really don't think that's the spirit of Torah. Torah is revelation. It's not exactly rules. I mean, there are rule elements, but that kind of misses the point. It's a disclosure of God's character. It's a gift. And that's really what motivates me in this series. I'd like us to think differently about law. I'd like us to think differently about it as being God's revelation. It's Torah for today. What God revealed to Israel is for us. Now this is what's tricky, because when we read the laws of the Bible, so to speak, right, they seem obscure, they seem weird, they seem culturally just strange to us. That's because God is speaking Israel's language. He is expressing his Torah in ways that they can understand, right? And that's why it seems strange to us. But here's my point. The Torah is not so much to us. It's actually to ancient Israel. But it is for us. And I don't want us to miss that. The Torah is for us today. It is for us, even though it's not to us. That's why I'm here to explain, right? It needs explanation, right? It's not to us. It's not packaged in cultural terms that are familiar to me, but they're actually familiar to Israel. And so that's why it needs explanation. Anyhow, you can see here our history together over the last 3 days. This is the 5th of 5 talks, so that works out nicely, 5 books in the Torah. And we've had a God focus, a theocentric focus, where we've looked at God revealing, God rescuing, God dwelling, God staying, and now finally, God sharing. And I got to tell you, this is the one I'm excited about. God sharing, because this is actually the game changer in terms of how you think about the law. It's not so much law, it's more of like God sharing with us what he's like. It's God saying, here's an example of what my character looks like in a situation. If this situation, then this is what Torah would look like. Or how about this? If this situation, then here is what Torah might look like. Or here's another. Okay, what we get in the so-called laws are examples. Example after example after example, showing us what God's nature looks like in cultural context. Okay? That's what's going on. And I think that's so important. That's a game changer for us. And that helps us read the laws. It helps us interpret the laws. It helps us to actually know what to make of them, because they're examples. They're not meant to be like rules for all time. Hear me on this. These laws are not like set in stone as like all people everywhere must always do exactly this as it's written. Actually, no. These prescriptions in the Bible, they actually change within the Bible. Okay, so get this. At Mount Sinai, God reveals the 10 Commandments, right? And then right after that, we get a section in Exodus where we get all these case laws, like if this, then this, and if this, then this. What it is the first generation was given the Ten Commandments, and then they were given a bunch of examples showing them what it looked like for that first generation, what it looked like to uphold that Torah. That was the first contextualization of the Ten Commandments. It was for that first generation at Mount Sinai. Well, now fast forward to Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is a whole generation later. It's 40 years later than that first giving of the Decalogue at Mount Sinai. In Deuteronomy, what we get is we get the same Ten Commandments, but then we get different laws. We get different examples, different illustrations of what that same law looks like, what that same Torah looks like. So remember, the commandments haven't changed. The commandments are the same in Exodus 20 as they are in Deuteronomy 5. Same commandments. Okay, there's a few words that get a little bit different, but for the most part, it's the same. What's different, though, are the illustrations. Now, some things remain the same between the two generations. And, you're still not supposed to murder somebody, from first generation to second. But other things kind of get modified. They get tweaked just over the course of 40 years. So what I want you to think about is that we have two contextualizations of Torah. We have contextualization number 1, which is given at Mount Sinai. Contextualization number 2 is given in Deuteronomy on the plains of Moab right before they conquer the Promised Land. So this is a time where Israel is supposed to now think in a fresh way about the same commandments. The commandments remain, but now think in a fresh way about what it looks like to uphold those commandments. Okay? And so when we look at the laws this way, it helps us see the principles. It helps us see the values that characterize God. And that's the point. This is the deep reading of Torah that I'm after. Okay? This is what I'd like us to come away with an appreciation of. That is, we can study the Torah in order to learn about God, in order to learn about his character, his values, his likes and dislikes. That's what we're after. Okay? So you can tell I get excited about Deuteronomy. It's a great book. Deuteronomy is, I haven't even opened my slides yet here. I'm just getting started. But anyway, Deuteronomy is like, the way you think of the book of Romans in the New Testament, the book of Romans is like this amazing treatise on the gospel, right? And all the facets of the gospel, right? It's this just densely and beautifully crafted document that's explaining all the facets of the new covenant. Well, what Romans does in the New Testament is very similar to what Deuteronomy does in the Old Testament. Deuteronomy is like the covenant summary. It's like the covenant document for the whole collection. And I would say the book of Deuteronomy is therefore foundational for the whole Bible. If we're to understand the stories of the Old Testament, or even any of the New Testament for that matter, you have to know Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy says it all. It's all there. God has disclosed his character in a very compact and beautifully crafted manner in the book of Deuteronomy, and that becomes the foundation for the rest of the Bible. I mean, the Old Testament itself, the way the Hebrew tradition even looks at their Old Testament, they divide it into 3 parts. The Hebrew Bible goes Torah, prophets, and writings. And this is not in my notes, but the prophets are built on the Torah, and the writings are built on the Torah. The prophets begin with Joshua. Joshua chapter 1 begins with meditation on Torah, meditation on the book of the law. It's talking about Deuteronomy, right? And the prophets begin, the first chapter of the prophets actually says it's based on Torah. And then you jump to the writings. The writings begin with the Psalms. The very first Psalm also begins in the same place, meditating on the Torah day and night, okay? And the life that brings us. The point is this: the different parts of the canon are built on Torah and built specifically on the summary that Deuteronomy gives us. So, none of this was planned, but look, when we read the rest of the Bible, I would encourage you to bring Deuteronomy with you. bring the Torah with you, because that will actually infuse your reading of the rest. Okay? Ask yourself when you're reading stories of the Old Testament, what does Deuteronomy say about this story? About what people are doing in the story, or what people are saying in the story? Deuteronomy will help you to process the material better. Anyhow, that's my apologetic for reading Deuteronomy. We need this book. It's an important book. All right. Well, if you've heard me teach for long, you might have heard the word chiasm. Any student who's taken me for class can attest I talk about chiasms a lot. Chiasms basically look like this, okay? It's basically where you have framing around usually a central point, and it helps us to focus on a central idea that kind of governs the other portions of the text. I would first just suggest that the Pentateuch itself, with its fivefold division, has a chiastic shape to it. All right, so that the presence of God is emphasized in the center with the book of Leviticus, and then that's framed by the transition books where Israel is on the move in Exodus and Numbers, and then that is framed on the periphery with covenant, covenant, covenant. So in Genesis, the covenant is established, it's introduced, we learn about what it is, and then of course in Deuteronomy we revisit this covenant idea, and we see that really to understand the presence of God properly, it must be understood in a covenant context. Covenant provides the context for God's dwelling and God's presence with us, okay? And so Deuteronomy is going to kind of put a bow on that and tie that up for us, okay? Deuteronomy is revisiting this theme that Genesis introduced. All right, so that's just to whet our appetite. The next thing I wanted to say, yeah, it's right here. Yeah, there we go. Is that Deuteronomy, when I call it a covenant document, what I really mean is it's a treaty, okay? In Hebrew, the word for covenant and treaty is the same word, right? And so what we see in Deuteronomy is actually that it's one giant treaty document. Now, what am I talking about? In the ancient Near East, there are many treaties made between nations, huge nations, like we're talking about empires that are making treaties with one another, and one typically that rules the other. But you have like the Hittite Empire, for instance, that makes a treaty with Egypt, or vice versa. And so one is the suzerain, the other is the vassal, and they draw up these huge treaties. We have 30 to 40 of these major political treaties that have been documented in the ancient Near East from the time of Moses. They're all from the time of Moses, right? And so what we see in these 30 to 40 treaties is this outline in every single one of them. They start with this preamble and the historical prologue. They talk about like the history. How did the two kingdoms get to this place in time? Then they talk about the stipulations, or you might say like the sanctions. Like what are the rules of how are they defining the relationship, right? The DTR, is that what it's called? Define the relationship? You know, so I don't know any acronyms. That's about as much as I know. So they talk about that in the stipulations. Then the document statement basically talks about like where do we store the treaty, like the actual document, or how do we make it public information? How do we post it and make it public? And then curses and blessings. If you keep the stipulations, you're blessed. If you break them, you're cursed. And then the witnesses. Typically in the ancient Near East, the witnesses are the gods. The gods are witness to the treaty that two nations are doing. But of course, that doesn't quite work in Deuteronomy because there's only one God, right? And so instead, in Deuteronomy, the witnesses that are brought to bear are creation itself. Heaven and earth bears witness to what God is doing in Deuteronomy. What God is doing, so I hope you can see here, this outline, the outline comes from the ancient Near Eastern political documents. But in parentheses, these are the chapters of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy follows the same outline that you find in these political documents. Okay, so Deuteronomy is a treaty It is a covenant. What makes it the reason why we call it covenant and not treaty, though, is not because a different word is used. It's the same word. By covenant, we mean God made the treaty with Israel. And typically covenants in the ancient Near East, actually all the time in the ancient Near East, treaties are between two human parties. Two human parties. In Deuteronomy, it's between Yahweh and Israel. And this is unprecedented. No God has ever made a treaty with human beings. No God cares to do so. Okay, but this is what sets the Lord apart. So in this book, we have a very unique presentation of God's covenant with his people. Well, I've talked about this idea of God sharing, God revealing himself, and that's really the central idea I want us to think about today. I really only have one point today, and that's this. God is sharing his character, his values, his likes and his dislikes. That's what's going on in this whole book. He's the suzerain, he's the great king, and he's saying to Israel, who's his vassal, he's saying, this is what I expect of you because this is who I am. I'm not just laying down rules in an arbitrary way. These are illustrations of what it looks like to live in my presence. If you are to be identified with me as my people, well, here's who I am. This is what I'm about. So this should characterize you. I love this passage, Deuteronomy 4. In Deuteronomy 4, let me read the text here. This is one of those places where we see how unique God's character is. We see that it's unique in the context of the ancient world. The Lord says in verse 5, this is Deuteronomy chapter 4, see, I have taught you statutes and rules, as the Lord my God commanded me, that you should do them. Sorry, this is Moses talking, but you'll see it's also from God. But it's Moses talking. See, I have taught you statutes and rules, as the Lord my God commanded me, that you should do them in the land that you are entering to take possession of it. He says, verse 6, keep them and do them, for that will be your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of all the peoples. By the way, that's not Israel, that's the nations. So it will be wisdom and understanding in the sight of all the surrounding peoples, who, when they hear all these statutes, they will say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. All right, so the nations are observing that Israel's ways are unique. The nations are observing that there is wisdom and understanding in this place. They go on in verse 7, or he goes on to talk about the nations in verse 7. For what great nation is there that has a God so near to it as the Lord our God is to us? God's nearness to Israel is unlike any other phenomenon that any nation has ever seen before. What other great nation is there that has a God so near to it as the Lord our God is to us whenever we call upon him? And what great nation is there that has statutes and rules so righteous as all this Torah that I set before you today? Okay? This is an acknowledgement that God's Torah is unique because God is unique. This is an acknowledgement that when the people of God live out God's Torah, the nations notice, the surroundings take notice, and they say, whoa, something's different here. There is wisdom here. There's righteousness here. There's a close God who lives with and among his people. There's something different. Okay? This is what sets Israel apart. It's the fact that Israel they have the ability to embody Torah, which is to say they can embody God's values, God's character, and so forth. That's what the Torah is all about. All right, so I've suggested today that the many case laws in Deuteronomy are examples, that we should take them as illustrations, not necessarily as rules for all time, but more like as inspiring examples. They inspire us to think right about God. Okay? I think that's their function. It's example after example after example to teach us how to think right so that we can make our own contextualizations. Right? Because that's what we have to do. Israel had to make certain contextualizations at Sinai. They had to make new ones in the plains of Moab, in the case of Deuteronomy. And then all throughout the rest of the Old Testament, Israel is making new prescriptions, discovering anew what it was like to live out God's values. I think we need to be doing the same. We need to be inspired by these examples so that we see what Torah is essentially about, and we can then creatively, with the Spirit's help, we can creatively talk about what it looks like today to live out God's character, to live like Christ, to live sacrificially, to love our neighbor, to love God. I mean, just all these principles of Torah that we can apply in our lives. Okay, so here's the thing. My big kind of delivery today has to do with the way Deuteronomy is structured. Now, we've talked about how you get the 10 Commandments, but then what I'm suggesting is that the core of Deuteronomy is taking the commandments in order and illustrating each one of them to give us example after example. So, what you see here, I've listed the commandments on the far left, okay, just 1 through 10, and then just a word to kind of help us remember which commandment that was, right? So other gods, carved images, Yahweh's name, Sabbath day, parents, murder, adultery, stealing, false witness, coveting. What I've done on the far right is give you a section of Deuteronomy that actually illustrates that commandment. So, the commandment about other gods, like don't have any other gods before me, you might wonder, what does that look like in life? Like, what does it mean that God is first? Give me an example. Well, I'm glad you asked. Read Deuteronomy chapter 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. And it'll give example after example after example showing what that commandment is essentially about. What it means to say the Lord our God alone. Him alone do I serve. And by the way, that's the longest exposition section you get of a commandment is like right there. First commandment is foundational. We must get that one right. Okay? I had a pastor years ago in Chicago when I was doing some schooling there. He used to always say, in almost every sermon, and I loved this, he used to always say, the most important rule of the spiritual life is that he's God and we're not. Period. That was it. You know, it's like, yes, that's it. You know, God first. He's God, I'm not. That's number one. We have to get that right. Okay, what does it mean about carved images? Well, you got to read chapter 12 of Deuteronomy, and it shows specifically what it looks like. And so on and so forth. Do you get what I'm saying here? How the sections of Deuteronomy correspond in order to the commandments in the Decalogue. That's a big aha, okay? Now, we don't have time to go through every commandment, right? Phew. Wow. Even when I go all semester long on this, we still don't even get through it all because there's a lot here. And so today, I'm just going to focus in on one example to just show how this works. And so the one I want to focus on is commandment number 6. It's the murder command. And you're probably all thinking, oh, good. Well, at least I passed that one. I haven't murdered anyone recently, so I'm good. Well, not so fast. Because when we look at chapter 19, 20, and 21, you'll see what it looks like to uphold that murder command. And you see that, oh, so it's not just about, taking the life of my neighbor. It is that, but it's actually, it's much deeper than that. Maybe I have committed murder now that I think about it, and I'll show you what I mean. When we get into this, you start seeing what's the spirit of the command. What are the principles of this murder command? When we say thou shalt not murder, that runs deep, actually. We need to ask, am I acting murderously? Am I in the pathway of murder? Because that runs deeper. It's more about the heart, right? And when we look at the examples about the murder command, we start seeing the nature of it. By the way, here's just a quote for you to think about. One scholar, where he was talking about the structure of Deuteronomy and how each command is illustrated in a corresponding section of laws, he put it this way. He said, the purpose of the stipulations, which, by the way, the stipulations are chapter 6 all the way to 26. It's explaining the Ten Commandments. Actually, the Ten Commandments are part of it too. I would say the stipulations probably run from chapter 5, which is the Ten Commandments, all the way to 26. Okay, and he's saying the stipulations section addresses the spirit of the law. This is accomplished by developing a legislative portfolio of each of the Ten Commandments in order to discuss their implications, their fine points, and their broad implications. Wow, that's huge, okay? So he's saying Deuteronomy takes the commands in order and expounds on each one of them in this section through chapter 26. This is big. This is a profound idea. All right, so you ready? There's the murder command. I made this yesterday, all right? I typed this up yesterday just to summarize some stuff I had looked at long ago, but I wanted to put it all in one chart for you, all right? What I'm doing here is you can see on the far left is chapter 19, verse 1, and it continues all the way down to chapter 22, verse 23. In 19, 20, and 21 of Deuteronomy, we have an elaboration on what murder means. This is huge. This is huge. It starts out talking about cities of refuge. It starts out with the idea that we should not treat accidental death as murder. Right? Now, this is true in our own society, in our own, homicide laws today. We don't treat accidental death as murder. There is a difference, right? Well, the Bible talked about this too. We need to think rightly about murder, because what we learn in this passage, you can see in parentheses there, I said murder expresses anger or hatred toward neighbor. This is a principle that is laid out in this section. The first 13 verses is where we see that acting murderously grows out of anger. Acting murderously grows out of hatred toward neighbor. And in accidental death, of course, that's not the case. So if someone is accidentally killed, well then it most likely didn't come from a place of anger or hatred. And that, of course, needs to be determined in due process. But that's what this is all about. Like, think rightly about murder, okay? And one of the lessons there is that, murder's about anger. Murder's about hatred. That's different. Okay. The next example, property boundaries. This may seem weird, right? Like, the law basically says, don't move the property boundary of your neighbor, and it kind of leaves it at that. And it's sort of like, what does that have to do with anything, right? Well, the way I've put it here, the way I've interpreted it here is, don't secretly steal your neighbor's inheritance. To do so is a murderous act. By the way, this is a sin that's done in secret. You go and move the property boundary to expand your own territory and steal it from your neighbor, right? You may think, that's something I do and nobody really notices or sees and I can get away with it. And no, you know what? You're murdering your neighbor. Okay, you're talking about his ancestral inheritance that he's received that's been passed down in his family for hundreds of years, right? To do that kind of thing is a murderous act. Okay, and so now we're starting to see that acting murderously can take lots of forms. You can act murderously towards your neighbor, and your neighbor may be still alive, but you've committed murder towards them. Wow, that's interesting. Okay, next example, laws concerning witnesses. Don't let a malicious witness act murderously. Okay, in other words, look, we all know the legal system does not always work the way it should. Sometimes you have corrupt people. Sometimes you have a malicious witness who's actually a false witness, right? And somebody could be condemned to death because you have a false witness. Well, we need to put in some safeguards. We need to put in some procedures for that. And so it's important to have 2 or 3 witnesses in order to mitigate this possibility. So again, we need to be thinking about this. Check this one out. Chapter 20, laws concerning warfare. Ooh, this one's interesting. You might ask the question, as an Israelite obviously did, but we even might ask the question, if I'm in the military and I'm engaged in war, am I committing murder? Am I breaking the 6th commandment in war? That's actually a really good question. It's a complicated question. And it's one that the Bible actually engages right here. Right here, we get a whole chapter about this. And look at this is how I'd summarize it. Don't act murderously in warfare, but treat your own people and your enemies with dignity. Interesting. Interesting. Killing in war, by the way, is not necessarily murder. Now notice, not necessarily. It could be. It could be. That's for you to think about, right? Because again, what we've learned here is that murder has to do with anger towards neighbor, it has to do with hatred towards neighbor, and so forth. There are ways to do murder in war, and it happens a lot, unfortunately. But it need not be that way. And this is an area for soul searching, right? Not all warfare is necessarily murder. It's we need to think about this, okay? And so we could have a big discussion just on that, but the Bible is not skirting difficult questions here. Really good question. All right, the next case, 21, verses 1 through 9. Atonement for unresolved murders. This is a bit of a weird one. What if you find a corpse in the middle of nowhere and you don't know who killed the guy, right? What do? You know, it's a whole kind of scenario where we see that actually you take this very seriously, and life is sacred and valuable, and we don't take this lightly, okay? Life is precious, and that comes out very clear here. The community must take it very seriously, and the community must take responsibility and deal with it responsibly and in a loving way, especially when the perpetrator is unknown. Okay, so anyhow, complex situations. Inheritance rights of the firstborn. Okay, what happens in the broken situation that a guy has 2 wives and he loves one wife more than the other, but his oldest child is from the unloved wife? Well, in that kind of a broken, messed up situation, make sure you uphold Torah by not depriving the firstborn of his inheritance, even though he's the unloved one, right? Wow, that gets dicey, right? By the way, that reminds me of something that's important here. The Bible is not, by giving each one of these situations, the Bible is not prescribing this situation. God isn't saying you should have 2 wives or that you should have a favorite among the 2. Same thing with warfare. He's not saying you should go to war, even. That's not what he's saying. These are examples, and all of them are broken examples, every single one. God is not saying that the scenario should be played out to begin with, but these are illustrations. Some of them are hypothetical, quite honestly. They're hypothetical situations to teach us how to think about God's values. God knows that we have hard hearts. I mean, Jesus even says this, because of the hardness of their hearts, God prescribes certain things. Yes, every one of these examples is because we are broken. They presume broken situations. But even in our brokenness, we can still act like God acts. That's what he's after. Broken situations can be redeemed, and that's what all of these situations are about. Okay, a rebellious son, this is another one. This is talking about when a child rejects the Torah of his parents, right? The idea here is that parents are supposed to pass down the covenant. They're supposed to pass down the Torah. We would say the gospel, right? And And when children reject the teaching of their parents, this is a life and death matter. This is a capital matter. It's a matter of life and death. We know this. Spiritual life, spiritual death. This is huge. And so here I've summarized this one as don't act murderously towards your parents. And this is not just for young people. This is for all of us. We all have parents, folks. All of us do. The issue here is don't act murderously by rejecting the gospel that's been passed down to us, rejecting the teaching that's been passed down to us. All right, finally, a man hanged on a tree is cursed. I put it this way. Don't act murderously towards a dead murderer. Wait, let that sink in. Don't act murderously towards a dead murderer. Now, again, these are hypothetical situations, but maybe not. Israel actually had this situation quite a bit. In warfare in the ancient Near East, people didn't just win wars. They kept winning after the war was over. Okay, like after you kill your enemy, you might desecrate their body and humiliate them even more after they're dead. Okay, this actually happened a lot in the ancient Near East. And folks, there's no room for this with God's people because that's about revenge, that's about hatred and anger and not letting justice reign. It says winning is not enough. I want to keep winning. I want to keep sticking it to them. Right? That's revenge. And Israel struggled with this, and so do we, frankly. We don't like to just win. We like to really win, right? And so it's important to think about even a case where a perpetrator was convicted and he's a murderer and then he's put to death for his crime. Even in that case, let justice reign and don't go beyond justice, okay? This is the whole eye for an eye concept. The whole eye for an eye concept doesn't say you must pluck out another person's eye when they pluck out your eye. That's not really what it's saying. What it's saying is there's a limit to justice. Don't go beyond what justice requires. If he plucked out your eye and justice, you may want to pluck out his eye. You don't have to, but you could go that far, but no further. The point is to go beyond that would be abusive and revengeful and anger-based and so forth. So anyway, these are broken situations that are teaching us to think rightly about God. All right, so that's important. God is showing us what his values look like. I realize this is a lot of information, but I thought it was important to go into some detail here to show what Moses is doing in Deuteronomy. What Moses is doing in Deuteronomy is he's showing us the spirit of the law, spirit of Torah, okay? He wants us to not just follow rules. He wants us to live in freedom. He wants us to think rightly about God and to work it out in various contexts today. Okay? So, my big point today was, I think it was expressed in my my previous slide, but it's here too. It's this idea that God shares. He's sharing himself. He is disclosing himself, and he's giving us many examples to show us what that looks like. So what we see here is that Moses is inviting us to a deeper reading of Torah, a deeper reading. The applications are to Israel, but the principles are for us. The application is not always direct for us. It's often going to be indirect, right? Like we get the principle from the text, and then we take that principle and we ask, what does this look like in my life? Okay. Finally, we must bring this back to Jesus, right? And this is why I get so excited about this. I opened our series on Friday night. I know not everyone was there on Friday night, but I opened our series talking about the Sermon on the Mount, which is a strange place to start a series about the law, about the Old Testament, but maybe not. I think Jesus actually views Deuteronomy in the way I've presented. I think the way he views the law is this way. Jesus advocates a deep reading of the law, not a surface level reading. You know, after he talks about how he fulfills the Torah and so should we, all right, he says in chapter 5, after he talks about that, he starts going into an exposition of the 10 Commandments. Ooh, this is where it gets interesting. And Jesus says, you've heard that it was said, do not commit murder, but I tell you. Remember this whole discussion? Now, interestingly, I chose murder for this reason, of course, because Jesus also talks about murder. Jesus elaborates on what the murder command is all about. And what does he say? Anger toward your neighbor. That's murder. And it's like, oh, I see. All right. So maybe I am a murderer. Maybe I'm not exempt on this one. No, that's exactly right. Jesus wants us to know that we need to read more deeply. By the way, after Jesus talks about murder and anger, he gives another one. He goes, you've heard it said. And what's the next one? Does anyone remember in Matthew 5? It's okay. You don't need to turn there. But does anyone remember the next one? I'll tell you, it's adultery. Now that's important. If we go back to my Decalogue, we don't need to, but in the 10 Commandments, the 6th commandment is murder. The 7th commandment is adultery. Oh, interesting. Jesus is going in order through the commandments. What we get in the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus is actually elaborating on the commandments the way that Moses did. He's taking the same order, and he's saying, let's talk about murder for a minute. Okay, now let's move on. Now let's talk about adultery and what that's essentially about. And he cuts deep, and he says, actually, this is about lust. It's about deeper issues than you might think. You might think you haven't committed adultery, or you might think that doesn't apply to me. I'm young. I haven't even thought about such things, right? Actually, we all wrestle with it, no matter how old we are, because it's about deeper issues, about lust. And so Jesus is going deep, and he wants us to think about the law in this way. Look, the scandal of the Sermon on the Mount is that Jesus reads the law the way Moses did. Jesus' understanding of the law is an old understanding. It's not a new one. It's an old one. That's actually what's so crazy about it, because the Pharisees are not reading it that way. They don't like the way Jesus reads the Torah. I'll tell you that. They don't like it at all. But Jesus reads it the way Moses did. He's reading it on the deeper level, not on the surface level. The Pharisees read it on the surface. They count the 613 commandments of the Old Testament, and they say, do this and you will live. No, actually, no. No. Live in accordance with God's character. That's the point. Okay? It's not just a list of do's and don'ts. We need to think more deeply about the Torah. Okay, so Jesus shows us the way on this. Wrapping this up, this has been a fun series with you all. We have looked at God, we've looked at God, we've looked at God. In the Torah, the way he presents himself. And he reveals, he rescues, he dwells, he stays. Finally, he shares. I hope this can help us read the law well, and maybe even eliminate that word law from our vocabulary. Just call it Torah, because that's what it is. It's God's revelation, it's his instruction, and he is inviting us, he's sharing, he's inviting us to do it with him, to do it like him, to uphold the Torah the way Jesus did. That's what we're advocating here, okay? All right, well, let's embody the Torah like Jesus. Let's not unhitch from the Old Testament the way some have said to. Let's choose life. Choose life by choosing Torah. Choose life by embodying the Torah. Amen. All right. Lord God, I just want to thank you for sharing with us. I want to thank you for disclosing yourself to us. Lord, we ask by your Spirit that you would open our eyes to your character in the Torah. Lord, that we would see your heart in it. Lord, help us to see your values and your likes and dislikes. Lord, we want to like what you like. And we ask you to help us to do that. Thank you for giving us Jesus and showing us more of what that looks like. We pray in his powerful name. Amen.